November 19, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The transport truck lurched to a stop outside the gates of a prisoner of war camp that looked nothing like what Clara Hoffman had imagined. She had expected barbed wire and watchtowers, gray buildings, and armed guards with hostile faces. What she saw instead was a sprawling compound under a vast Texas sky, with wooden barracks that looked almost comfortable in the fading afternoon light. Beside her, 29 other German women sat in tense silence, their auxiliary corps uniforms dusty and worn from the long journey from the East Coast Processing Center. Clara was 24 years old, an administrative clerk from Munich who had believed she was serving her country's defense. Now she was a prisoner in enemy territory, thousands of miles from home, facing an uncertain future that terrified her more than she wanted to admit. The younger women looked even more frightened. 19-year-old Marie Zimmerman clutched a small photograph of her family, her hands trembling. Hannah Mueller, just 21, stared straight ahead with the blank expression of someone trying not to cry. The guards who met them at the gate were professional but not cruel. They processed the women efficiently, assigning them to barracks and explaining camp rules in English that most of them barely understood. Clara, who had studied some English in school, found herself translating for the others, her voice shaking as she tried to make sense of words like mess hall and roll call. The American soldiers didn't shout or threaten. They simply went about their duties with a matter-of-fact efficiency that was somehow more unsettling than hostility would have been. As evening approached, a guard announced that it was time for dinner. The women exchanged nervous glances. They had heard stories about prison camps, about starvation rations, and cruel deprivation. Clara remembered the propaganda she had been shown about American brutality, about how prisoners were treated worse than animals. She steeled herself for whatever meager scraps they would be given, determined to maintain her dignity no matter what humiliation awaited them. They were led to a large dining hall that smelled of wood smoke and spices. Long tables were set with metal trays and cups, and then the food began to arrive. Private Carlos Ramirez, a young Mexican-American soldier with kind eyes, carried large pots to each table. He ladled something into their bowls, a thick, reddish-brown mixture that steamed in the cooling evening air. Beside it, he placed squares of golden bread that glistened with butter. Clara stared at her tray in complete confusion. The bread was unlike anything she had seen before, crumbly and golden yellow, with a slightly sweet smell. The bowl contained what appeared to be beans in a rich, spicy sauce with chunks of meat floating in it. Around her, the other women sat frozen, uncertain whether this was some kind of test or trick. Marie lifted a spoonful of the chili to her lips and tasted it. Her eyes widened in shock. The taste that exploded in Marie's mouth was nothing like she had expected. The chili was rich and complex, with layers of flavor she couldn't identify. There was heat, yes, but also depth: tomatoes, meat, beans, and spices that danced on her tongue in ways that German food never had. She took another spoonful, then another, unable to stop herself despite the confusion flooding her mind. Around the table, other women were having similar experiences, their faces showing the same mixture of shock and guilty pleasure. Clara picked up the square of golden bread and broke off a piece. It was still warm, crumbling slightly in her fingers. She took a small bite and felt her eyes prickle with unexpected emotion. The cornbread was slightly sweet, buttery, with a texture that was both cake-like and substantial. It wasn't German bread, but it was undeniably good. When she dipped it into the chili, the combination was even better. The sweet bread balanced the spicy sauce in a way that felt almost magical. Across the mess hall, Cook Pearl Jenkins watched the German women's reactions with quiet satisfaction. The 56-year-old woman had been cooking in this camp for 2 years, feeding German and Italian prisoners alongside American soldiers. She had seen this same expression many times before the shock of discovering that their captors weren't monsters, that American food could be generous and flavorful, that perhaps everything they had been told was a lie. She nodded to Carlos, who continued serving second helpings to any woman who timidly raised her hand. 32-year-old Greta Klein, the former nurse from Hamburg, ate slowly and methodically, but her mind was racing. She had spent months believing that capture meant death or worse. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were barbaric, especially toward women. They would be starved, abused, perhaps killed. Yet here she sat, eating a meal that was not only adequate but actually delicious. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. How could enemies feed you this well? How could the people you had been taught to hate show such casual generosity? 27-year-old Lotte Braun, the radio operator from Frankfurt, refused to let herself enjoy the meal. She ate because she was hungry, but she kept her face carefully neutral, her posture rigid. This was a trick, she told herself. They were fattening the prisoners up for some purpose, or trying to win their cooperation through false kindness. Real enemies didn't feed you their own food, didn't give you warm bread and seasoned meat. She would not allow herself to be manipulated by American propaganda, even if it came in the form of surprisingly good chili. But even as Lot maintained her defensive walls, she couldn't help noticing small details that chipped away at her certainty. The guards ate the same food the prisoners did, sitting at nearby tables and talking among themselves. Private Ramirez smiled when he offered second helpings, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Corporal Helen Parker, one of the few female guards, walked through the mess hall checking on the women, asking in slow, simple English if they needed anything. There was no cruelty in her face, no mockery, just professional concern. 3 weeks into their captivity, the routines of camp life had begun to feel almost normal. The women woke at dawn, attended roll call, performed assigned duties like laundry and cleaning, and gathered for meals that continued to surprise them. But it was Clara Hoffman who experienced the most unexpected transformation when Sergeant Jack Coleman approached her one morning with an unusual request. The 35-year-old Texan had been watching the prisoners carefully, noting which ones showed initiative and which ones seemed to be struggling most with the adjustment. Clara had caught his attention not just for her English skills, but for the way she examined everything in the mess hall with the curiosity of someone trying to understand rather than simply endure. He had talked it over with Pearl Jenkins, and the cook had agreed that an extra set of hands in the kitchen might benefit everyone. "Miss Hoffman," Coleman said through a mixture of English and gestures, "Cook Jenkins needs help. You interested in kitchen work?" Clara's heart hammered as she processed the question. Working in the kitchen meant access to food preparation, meant learning about American cooking, meant extended contact with the camp staff. It felt dangerous and thrilling at the same time. She nodded slowly, and Coleman smiled. "Good. Report to the kitchen after roll call tomorrow." The next morning, Clara found herself standing in the large camp kitchen, overwhelmed by the industrial-sized pots, the enormous stove, and the array of ingredients she had never encountered before. Pearl Jenkins stood at the center of it all, a commanding presence in her white apron, her dark hands moving with practiced efficiency as she prepared breakfast for 200 people. She looked at Clara with eyes that had seen a lifetime of both hardship and joy, and nodded toward a pile of vegetables. "Can you chop?" Pearl asked simply. Clara nodded and picked up a knife, grateful for a task she understood. As she worked, she watched Pearl and Carlos prepare the morning meal: scrambled eggs, bacon, biscuits, and gravy. The amount of butter and cream that went into American cooking shocked her. In Germany, such ingredients had been rationed for years. Here, they were used with abandon, as if abundance was just the normal state of things. Pearl noticed Clara's wide-eyed observation and chuckled. "Never seen so much food in one place, have you?" She didn't wait for an answer. "In America, we believe in feeding people proper. Don't matter if you're a soldier or a prisoner. Everybody eats." She paused in her work and looked directly at Clara. "My people know what it's like to be treated less than human. I don't hold with that, no matter who you are or where you come from." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Clara was only beginning to understand. Pearl Jenkins was black, which meant she faced discrimination in her own country. Yet here she was, showing kindness to German prisoners who came from a nation that had built its entire philosophy on racial hierarchy. The irony wasn't lost on Clara, and it made her deeply uncomfortable in ways she couldn't fully articulate. November 23, 1944. Thanksgiving Day arrived at Camp Hearn with a crisp autumn morning that reminded the German women of home, though Texas cold was nothing compared to the harsh winters they had known. Clara had been working in the kitchen for 2 weeks now, and she had mentioned to the other prisoners that the Americans were planning something special. The women were skeptical. They had learned not to expect much, even though their treatment so far had been surprisingly humane. When they entered the mess hall that afternoon, they stopped in collective amazement. The tables had been decorated with autumn leaves and small pumpkins. The usual metal trays had been replaced with actual plates. And the smell, the overwhelming, intoxicating smell of roasted meat and fresh bread and sweet spices, filled the entire building like a promise of something they had forgotten existed. Marie Zimmerman clutched Hannah's arm, her eyes wide with disbelief. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate joke. But it wasn't a joke. Pearl Jenkins and her kitchen staff, including Clara, had spent 2 days preparing a traditional Thanksgiving feast. As the women took their seats, guards and staff members began serving roasted turkey with rich brown gravy, cornbread stuffing seasoned with sage and onions, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans cooked with bacon, sweet potato casserole topped with pecans and marshmallows, and Pearl's famous buttermilk biscuits that seemed to melt on the tongue. For dessert, there would be pumpkin pie and pecan pie, both made from scratch. Greta Klein sat staring at her plate, unable to process what she was seeing. This wasn't prisoner food. This was feast food, celebration food, the kind of meal that families shared on special occasions. She looked around the mess hall and realized with a start that the American soldiers were eating the exact same meal at nearby tables. There was no separate, better food for the captors. Everyone, guards and prisoners alike, was being served from the same pots, eating the same generous portions. Captain Edward Morrison stood up to address the room. The 41-year-old commander from Boston had wrestled with whether this Thanksgiving celebration was appropriate. Some of his superiors had questioned the wisdom of treating enemy prisoners to American holiday traditions. But Morrison had ultimately decided that showing these women what American values actually meant was more powerful than any propaganda pamphlet. He cleared his throat and spoke, with Clara translating his words into German. Today is Thanksgiving, a day when Americans give thanks for our blessings and share what we have with others. You are far from your homes and families, and we know that is difficult. But while you are here, under American care, you will be treated with the dignity that all people deserve. We are not your enemies today. Today, we are simply people sharing a meal together. His words were met with stunned silence from the German women, many of whom had tears streaming down their faces. Lotta Braun felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. She had been so certain that the decent treatment was temporary, that the real cruelty would eventually emerge. But this abundance, this generosity, this inclusion in an American sacred tradition, this was something else entirely. December brought cold winds and the first real glimpse of Texas winter, though it was mild compared to the brutal German Decembers the women remembered. Clara had become indispensable in the kitchen, and Pearl Jenkins had begun teaching her not just how to cook American food, but the stories and traditions behind each dish. The kitchen had become a classroom where languages mixed freely, where German words for ingredients blended with English cooking terms, where understanding grew through the universal language of food. Private Carlos Ramirez had joined these informal lessons, eager to share his own heritage. He taught the women about Tex-Mex cuisine, explaining how Mexican and American Southern traditions had merged in this part of Texas to create something entirely new. He showed them how to make flour tortillas, his hands moving with practiced ease as he demonstrated the technique his grandmother had taught him. You flatten the dough like this, see? Not too thin, not too thick. Then you cook it on the hottest part of the griddle until it puffs up. Hannah Mueller watched with fascination as Carlos worked. She had been the most resistant to learning English, clinging to German as her last connection to home. But cooking terms were different. They were practical, necessary, and somehow less threatening than other vocabulary. Griddle, she repeated carefully. Tortilla. Puff up. Carlos grinned at her efforts and handed her a ball of dough. Your turn. Don't be scared, you can't mess it up too bad. His casual encouragement made her smile despite herself. The exchange went both ways. Greta Klein, drawing on memories of her mother's kitchen in Hamburg, taught Pearl how to make proper German potato pancakes Kartoffelpuffer. She explained how the potatoes had to be grated fine, the excess water squeezed out, the eggs and flour mixed just right. Pearl watched with genuine interest, asking questions and taking mental notes. We make something similar, she said, but we call them hash browns, or potato latkes, if you're talking to Jewish folks. Funny how people all over the world figure out good ways to cook potatoes. Marie, the youngest, found comfort in these kitchen sessions. The 19-year-old had been devastated by homesickness, crying herself to sleep most nights. But in the kitchen, surrounded by the smells of baking bread and simmering stews, she felt almost at peace. She learned how to make Pearl's legendary cornbread, memorizing the proportions of cornmeal, flour, eggs, buttermilk, and the secret ingredient, a spoonful of honey, that made all the difference. Pearl let her crack the eggs, measure the dry ingredients, and finally pour the golden batter into the hot cast-iron skillet. Corporal Helen Parker had started joining the kitchen sessions during her breaks. The 29-year-old from Georgia had owned a small restaurant before the war, and she understood food as a form of communication that transcended politics and nationality. She taught the women about Southern hospitality, about the tradition of welcoming strangers with good food and genuine warmth. Where I come from, she explained, you don't let anybody leave your house hungry. Doesn't matter who they are or where they're from. That's just basic human decency. These lessons became more than cooking instruction. They became language classes, cultural exchanges, and tentative friendships forming across enemy lines. January 1945 brought news that shattered the fragile sense of normalcy the camp had achieved. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany and Poland, American newspapers began publishing reports and photographs from liberated concentration camps. The images were grainy but unmistakable skeletal figures behind barbed wire, mass graves, evidence of systematic extermination on a scale that defied comprehension. Captain Morrison made the difficult decision to allow the German prisoners access to these newspapers, believing they had a right to know what had been done in their country's name. Clara sat in the camp library. An American newspaper spread before her and felt the world tilt on its axis. The headline read, Nazi death camp liberated thousands, found dead. The accompanying photographs showed horrors she couldn't process. Her hands trembled as she read the descriptions of gas chambers, crematoriums, medical experiments. This couldn't be real. This had to be Allied propaganda, exaggerations meant to demonize Germany. But the photographs didn't lie. And there were too many sources, too many witnesses, too many details that aligned across different accounts. Hannah found Clara there, tears streaming silently down her face. Is it true? The younger woman whispered in German. Did Germany really do these things? Clara couldn't answer. She had no words for what she was reading, no framework to understand how the country she loved, the country she had proudly served, could have committed such atrocities. She had known about anti-Jewish laws, yes, but this systematic murder of millions, this was beyond anything she had imagined possible. Greta Klein read the reports with a nurse's clinical eye, trying to maintain professional distance from the medical horror being described, but she couldn't. The accounts of doctors conducting experiments on prisoners, of using medical knowledge to inflict suffering rather than heal it, made her physically ill. She had taken an oath to do no harm. She had believed that German medicine represented the pinnacle of scientific achievement. Now she learned that German doctors had perverted everything medicine stood for, had become instruments of torture and death. That evening, the German women gathered in their barracks in stunned, horrified silence. Some, like Lotte Braun, still clung to denial. "It's propaganda," Lotte insisted, her voice sharp with desperation. "The Americans are making it up to justify what they did to our cities, to make us feel guilty." But even as she spoke, her words sounded hollow. Marie was sobbing openly, her 19-year-old worldview completely shattered. She had joined the Auxiliary Corps believing she was helping defend Germany from invasion. Now, she had to confront the possibility that she had been part of something evil. Pearl Jenkins found Clara in the kitchen late that night, sitting alone in the dark. The older woman didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside her. Finally, Clara spoke in halting English. "How can you be kind to us? After what my country did?" Pearl was quiet for a long moment. "You didn't do those things, child. You didn't know. But now you do know, and the question is what you're going to do with that knowledge. That's what defines a person, not what they didn't know, but how they act once they learn the truth." The words offered no comfort, but they gave Clara something she desperately needed, a path forward through the guilt and horror. Spring arrived in Texas with wildflowers covering the fields around Camp Hearn in blankets of blue and gold. The war in Europe was reaching its conclusion, and everyone knew it. German forces were collapsing on all fronts, and the question of what would happen to the prisoners became increasingly urgent. The women had spent the winter months in a strange limbo, working in the camp, learning English, and grappling with the devastating revelations about their homeland. The kitchen had become their sanctuary, a place where they could focus on creating something good rather than dwelling on the evil that had been done in their name. Clara had become Pearl's unofficial assistant, capable of preparing most American dishes without supervision. More importantly, she had become a bridge between the German prisoners and the American staff, translating not just words but helping both groups understand each other's perspectives. She had started keeping a small notebook of recipes, writing them down in both English and German, as if by preserving these culinary connections she could hold on to the strange peace she had found in this unlikely place. News of Germany's surrender came on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day was celebrated across America with church bells and street parties. At Camp Hearn, the mood was more subdued. The American staff celebrated quietly, relieved that the war in Europe was finally over. But for the German prisoners, the day brought not relief but dread. Germany had lost. Everything they had once believed in had crumbled, and now they faced the terrifying prospect of returning to a homeland that no longer existed in any form they recognized. Captain Morrison called a meeting with the senior German prisoners, including Clara, Greta, and Lotte. He explained that repatriation procedures would begin within weeks. The women would be processed through camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes and families. He spoke kindly but officially, following the protocols established by the Geneva Convention for the return of prisoners of war. What he didn't expect was the response his announcement received. Clara translated his words into German for the women gathered in the barracks that evening. The reaction was not the relief or joy one might expect from prisoners being told they were going home. Instead, there was anxiety, fear, and something else, a profound reluctance. "What home?" Marie asked, her voice breaking. "My village was bombed. I don't even know if my family is alive. And if they are, what will I tell them? That I spent the war being treated better by Americans than we treated people in our own camps?" Hannah voiced what many were thinking. "In Germany, we will be seen as failures, women who were captured, who were corrupted by enemy influence. They will say we were treated too well, that we forgot who we were." She paused, looking around at her fellow prisoners. "But maybe we did forget who we were. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe we were the people who could serve that regime without questioning. Maybe those people deserve to be forgotten." Over the following days, a remarkable conversation began among the prisoners. They talked about what they had learned in captivity, about the kindness they had experienced, about the American values they had witnessed through something as simple as shared meals. They discussed Pearl's philosophy that everyone deserved to be fed with dignity, Carlos's casual acceptance of people from different backgrounds, Helen's belief in hospitality regardless of nationality. These weren't abstract political concepts, they were lived values they had experienced daily. May 22, 1945. Captain Morrison stood before the assembled German prisoners in the mess hall, holding official documents from the War Department. The room was filled with the same tables where the women had experienced their first shocking taste of cornbread and chili 6 months earlier, where they had shared Thanksgiving dinner, where they had learned to cook American food and speak English. Now those tables represented a crossroads between two possible futures. "Ladies," Morrison began, with Clara translating, "transportation has been arranged for your repatriation to Germany. You will depart in 2 weeks. You'll be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to your homes." He paused, studying the faces before him. He had overseen many prisoner repatriations, but he had never seen this particular expression, not relief, but something closer to grief. Clara stood slowly, her hands shaking. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for days, but now that it arrived, the words felt impossible to speak. "Captain Morrison," she said in careful English, "may I speak for some of us?" He nodded, gesturing for her to continue. Clara looked at her fellow prisoners, seeing her own conflicted emotions reflected in their faces. She took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change everything. "Some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately." The silence that followed was profound. Morrison's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine shock. Sergeant Coleman, standing nearby, exchanged confused glances with Corporal Parker. Pearl Jenkins, watching from the kitchen doorway, wiped her hands slowly on her apron, her eyes glistening. Greta Klein stood next, followed by Hannah, Marie, and 7 other women. 11 prisoners total, standing together in a show of unity that had been forged over shared meals and kitchen conversations. Hannah spoke in halting English, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. "Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served, we learned it was not the Germany we believed in." Captain Morrison struggled to find words. In all his military experience, he had never encountered prisoners requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. "Miss Hoffman," he said carefully, "I need you to understand what you're asking. You would still be classified as enemy aliens. We have no framework for what you're requesting." Clara nodded. "We understand, Captain. But here, in this camp, we learned something. We learned what it means to be treated with dignity. We learned that enemies can become," she searched for the right word, "can become something else, something better." She gestured toward the kitchen. "Cook Jenkins taught us that everybody deserves to eat. Private Ramirez taught us that different people can work together. You taught us that America keeps its promises, even to enemies." Marie stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "In Germany, I have nothing. Here, I have learned who I want to become." Morrison looked at the determined faces before him and realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. The bureaucratic machinery of the United States government had never encountered a situation quite like this. Prisoners of war requesting to remain in enemy territory, asking for the chance to build new lives in the country that had defeated their homeland. Captain Morrison's urgent telegrams to Washington sparked debates that reached the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. But while officials deliberated, something remarkable was happening at Camp Hearn. The local community had gotten word of the German women's unprecedented request, and the response was overwhelmingly supportive. The church groups that had been visiting the camp, the families who had met the prisoners through various outreach programs, the townspeople who had heard stories about Pearl's kitchen and the transformation happening there, they began writing letters and making phone calls to officials, offering to sponsor the women if they were allowed to stay. Pearl Jenkins became one of the most vocal advocates. She testified before a military review board that the women had proven themselves through their work and their genuine remorse. "These girls aren't Nazis," she told the stone-faced officers. "They're young women who got caught up in something they didn't understand. But they've learned, and they've changed. America is supposed to be about second chances, about redemption. If we send them back to nothing, what does that say about who we are?" Sergeant Coleman wrote a detailed report documenting each woman's contributions to the camp. Clara's translation work had become essential to operations. Greta's medical assistance had helped the camp doctor treat both prisoners and staff. Hannah had taken over much of the administrative record-keeping. Marie had become Pearl's right hand in the kitchen, and her cornbread was now almost as good as the original. Each woman had found a way to contribute, to prove her worth beyond her status as a former enemy. The answer from Washington arrived in July, 3 months after the women had made their request. It was cautiously positive but came with conditions. The women would be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. They would need individual sponsors who could guarantee housing and employment. They would be required to report regularly to authorities and would face restrictions on their movements. And they would need to demonstrate continued good conduct and integration into American society. Within days, sponsors had been secured for all 11 women. A local restaurant owner offered Clara a job as a translator and assistant manager. The hospital in nearby Bryan agreed to sponsor Greta for nursing certification. Hannah found placement with a law office that needed someone fluent in German for international correspondence. Marie received the most surprising offer. Pearl Jenkins herself agreed to sponsor the young woman, offering her a room in her own home and a permanent position as her kitchen assistant. The women, who had chosen repatriation, departed in August, carrying with them letters from their American friends and recipes written in careful English. Those who stayed behind watched the trucks disappear and turned to face their new futures with hope and determination. 25 years later, November 1970. Clara Hoffman Coleman stood in her comfortable kitchen in Austin, Texas, preparing Thanksgiving dinner for her family. She was now Clara Coleman, married to the sergeant who had first noticed her potential and offered her that kitchen job so many years ago. Their 3 children moved around her, helping with preparations, speaking English with the slight Texas drawl that always made her smile. On the counter, cooling in cast-iron skillets, were squares of golden cornbread made from Pearl Jenkins's original recipe. The doorbell rang, and Clara wiped her hands on her apron, knowing exactly who had arrived. Greta Klein, now doctor. Greta Klein, head nurse at Austin General Hospital, stood on the porch with her husband and 2 children. Behind her came Hannah Mueller Davis, a successful translator who had married an attorney from Houston. Marie Zimmerman Jenkins arrived last, driving the car she had bought with money saved from her job at Pearl's restaurant, which she had inherited when Pearl passed away 3 years earlier. The women embraced in the doorway, speaking a mixture of English and German, their laughter carrying the warmth of shared history. Their children, who had heard the stories but couldn't quite imagine their mothers as young German prisoners, watched with curious affection. Once a year, on Thanksgiving, the women who had chosen to stay gathered together to remember and to give thanks. As they sat around Clara's table, passing bowls of chili and plates of cornbread, Clara raised her glass. "To Pearl," she said softly, and the others echoed her words. Pearl Jenkins had passed away in her sleep, but her legacy lived on in the recipes she had shared, in the kindness she had modeled, and in the lives she had changed through something as simple as a bowl of good food. Later, after the meal was finished and the children were playing in the yard, the 4 women sat together on Clara's back porch. Lotte Braun had written from Germany. She had returned in 1945 and had spent decades working in reconstruction efforts. Her letters spoke of a new Germany, democratic and peaceful, committed to facing its dark history with honesty. She had never regretted returning, just as Clara had never regretted staying. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they had served us different food that first night?" Marie asked, smiling. "If it had been bland soup and stale bread instead of cornbread and chili?" Clara laughed. We would still have been treated well, still have learned the same lessons. But maybe we wouldn't have been shocked into questioning everything quite so quickly. Greta shook her head. It wasn't just the food. It was what the food represented. Generosity, inclusion, the idea that even enemies deserved dignity. She looked at her friends, these women who had traveled such an unlikely journey together. The chili was delicious, but what really nourished us was discovering that we could become better people than we were,